You think Europe saying prepare for the worst case is just political theater to scare Russia. It isn't. What they're doing is quieter and way more serious. They're turning the fear of war into an operating system. Daily life looks normal on the surface, but behind the curtain hospitals, rail lines, logistics hubs, cyber teams start rehearsing a different world. And once a society can run in worst-case mode, the question stops being will there be war? It becomes, who's ready to function when it happens? Russia attacks NATO is still a hypothesis. The unsettling part is that Germany is treating the hypothesis like a procedure. Over the last 48 hours, January 27th to 28th, 2026, the signals piled up in a way that feels less like messaging and more like sequencing. Not one headline, a cluster, not one minister. A whole ecosystem moving at once, and two branches make this bigger than a Ukraine update. The idea of NATO without an American backstop and a separate worst case that doesn't need tanks at all, a nuclear systems failure tied to Zaporizhzhia. Here's the trick your brain plays on you. It hears worst case and imagines a speech, a warning, a scary sentence on a podium. But a real worst case doesn't live in language, it lives in inventory, routes, and checklists. You can bluff a press conference in an afternoon. You can't bluff a casualty pipeline, a rail timetable, or a legal framework that lets civilian infrastructure flip into emergency use. If Berlin is building those rails in paperwork and practice, it is because somebody inside the machine thinks the timeline is tighter than the public wants to hear. That's the first turn of the screw. Zoom out for a second, because the context is simple and brutal. Europe is talking about readiness in a way it avoided for decades, and Germany, because of geography, becomes the spine whether it wants the job or not. When planners picture a crisis on NATO's eastern flank, they don't picture heroic slogans. They picture bottlenecks. They picture bridges, fuel depots, hospital beds, rail nodes, and the awkward question of who coordinates what when everything is moving at once. Germany isn't just a country in that picture, it's the hallway. And then there's the other conversation running underneath the obvious one. The unthinkable isn't only Russia pushes further. The unthinkable is, what if the United States doesn't show up the way Europe has assumed for 75 years? Not because America vanishes overnight, but because priorities drift, politics swing, and commitments get conditional. Intelligence, strategic lift, logistics, missile defense, nuclear deterrence, those aren't just budget line items. They're the invisible scaffolding that holds an alliance upright. Without them, the logo stays the same, but the building creaks. Now add the third strand, because it's the kind people miss until it's too late. Zaporizhzhia is not a battlefield headline. It's a systems headline. A nuclear plant in a war zone is a stress test for power supply, cooling, staffing, maintenance, and restraint. 5 things war is designed to break. People hear nuclear risk and imagine a movie scene, a flash, a mushroom cloud. But most real worst cases are slower and uglier. Cascading grid failures, compromised safety margins, frantic decisions made under pressure, and everyone praying the backups work. I'm not saying disaster is inevitable. I am saying the mere fact that serious actors game it out tells you how wide the blast radius could be even without a wider war. So what is actually happening when officials say worst case? It's not that they want the worst case, it is that they're trying to shave the time between decision and action down to almost nothing. That's the whole game. In a real crisis, your first enemy isn't Russia. It's delay in moving supplies, delay in triage, delay in repairing a sabotaged rail junction, delay in knowing what's real when cyber attacks scramble your screens, and when you realize delay is the killer, you stop thinking like a politician and start thinking like an air traffic controller. Think of war like a fast-moving wildfire. The thing that decides whether your house survives is rarely the speech the mayor gives on TV. It's whether the roads are clear, the water pressure holds, the evacuation routes are marked, the radios work, and the crews already know their roles before the smoke arrives. That's the mental model Europe is shifting toward. Germany isn't getting tougher. Germany is making sure the pumps turn on when the sirens do. Different vibe. Same stakes. If you want one practical lens to stay sane as you watch this unfold, it's this: ignore the volume of the rhetoric and track the mechanics of readiness, medical capacity, transport corridors, fuel and ammunition logistics, and cyber resilience. Those rarely move unless the risk feels real, and there's a detail that makes it heavier. Germany has already been openly planning for mass casualties in a scale that sounds insane until you remember Ukraine has been living it. Reports about casualty planning talk in numbers per day, not per month. Hospital trains, surge capacity, coordination with civilian facilities. That's not panic, that's normalization. When a health system practices many wounded at once, war has already entered civilian imagination. Even if no one says the word out loud, the body prepares before the mind admits it. This is where the story flips again. You might think the point of readiness is to prevent war, full stop. Sometimes it is, but readiness also changes perception, and perception changes behavior. When both sides expect a crisis, every movement looks sharper, every exercise looks like a feint, every defensive upgrade looks like a prelude. The risk isn't only escalation by intent, it's escalation by misread signals. A convoy becomes a threat, a cyber incident becomes a warning shot, and suddenly everyone is reacting to the version of reality that scares them most. So tonight, don't just ask, is Europe afraid? Ask the more uncomfortable question, what does a continent look like once worst-case mode becomes routine? Because once that switch is installed, it doesn't turn off cleanly, it hums in the background, waiting. And in the next part, I'm going to show you the 3 quiet systems that make this real: how hospitals, logistics, and hybrid defense snap together into one machine, and why that machine can deter war or accidentally accelerate it. The difference is thinner than anyone wants to admit. So let's build that machine, because once you see how it's wired, the headlines stop feeling random. The first layer is medicine, and it's not the romantic kind of medicine either. It's logistics with blood on it. Triage rules, surge beds, transport chains, staffing rotations, and the ugly math of how many can we stabilize before the next wave arrives. Reports about Germany's planning don't talk like peacetime health policy. They talk like battlefield throughput. Hospital trains, overflow wards, coordination with civilian clinics, and the assumption that drones and artillery don't politely space casualties out over weeks. If you're hearing that kind of language, it's because someone expects injuries to arrive in batches, not in trickles, and the reason this matters is simple: if you can't move the wounded, you can't move the fight. A modern conflict doesn't just break bodies, it breaks time. Minutes become currency. The wrong ambulance route turns into a political crisis. A jammed emergency room turns into a morale crisis, and once the pipeline is rehearsed, the state has quietly accepted something the public still debates out loud, that war isn't only a frontline event, it's a national rhythm. That is why the worst-case discussion keeps orbiting hospitals, because that's the first place reality shows up uninvited. You can pretend a scenario is hypothetical right up until the first mass casualty drill goes live. Now look at the second layer, because this is where Germany stops being a country and becomes a corridor. In a major NATO contingency, reinforcement doesn't teleport to the east, it moves through ports, rail yards, fuel depots, and highways that were designed for commerce, not crisis. The dream is flow, a steady stream of vehicles, ammunition, spare parts, and personnel moving without friction. The nightmare is one broken bridge, one sabotage junction, one cyber hit on scheduling systems, and the entire reinforcement story becomes a traffic jam with a flag on it. That's why you keep hearing about plans that read like infrastructure manuals rather than battle plans. If the hallway collapses, it doesn't matter how brave the people at the door are. This is also the part people misread as escalation when it's really stress testing. Moving forces is not only about warfighting, it's about proving to an adversary that the map can be used at speed. Deterrence isn't a speech, it's a timetable. The moment Russia believes the corridor is slow, vulnerable, or politically blocked, the temptation to gamble rises, and the moment Europe believes the corridor can run under pressure, the fear shifts from we can respond to we might respond too fast. That sounds backwards, but that's what readiness does. It changes the psychology on both sides. In geopolitics, the calendar can be as provocative as the tank. Then comes the third layer, and this one is quieter because it lives inside cables and routines. Hybrid defense is basically the art of keeping the lights on while someone tries to turn them off without declaring war. Sabotage, arson, disinformation, cyber intrusions. Drone probes things that can be denied, outsourced, or blamed on unknown actors. If you want to paralyze a logistics corridor, you don't always hit the convoy. You hit the fuel distribution software, the rail signaling, the dispatch center, the public confidence that keeps workers showing up, and that is why worst-case mode pulls cyber teams and internal security into the same room as medical planners and transport officials, because the first phase of a real crisis often looks like a weird string of accidents until the pattern becomes undeniable. Put those 3 layers together and you get a system that can switch states fast, almost like flipping a breaker. Casualties move through a pipeline. Reinforcements move through a corridor. The corridor is protected from hybrid disruption long enough to stay alive. That's the architecture. and the unsettling part is how normal it can look from the outside, because none of it requires sirens on day one. It looks like planning, it looks like coordination. It looks like resilience, but inside the machine, it's a rehearsal for operating without hesitation. Now, the twist that makes this more than a Germany story is it's above all of it, the alliance backbone. Europe can build corridors and hospitals, Europe can harden networks, but certain capabilities are not just expensive, they're slow to replicate. The invisible stack matters: intelligence, surveillance, strategic lift, integrated air and missile defense, command and control architecture, and the nuclear umbrella that nobody wants to discuss until they're forced to. That is why the phrase NATO without the United States hits like a punch even when officials don't say it loudly. Because it's not about flags, it's about which pieces disappear first when politics turns commitments into bargaining chips, and if those pieces wobble, worst-case mode stops being a contingency and starts looking like a replacement plan. Here's the part I want you to hold in your head, because it changes the entire tone. Readiness doesn't just deter an enemy. It disciplines your own society. To run worst-case mode, you need legal hooks, private sector cooperation, emergency authorities, inventory rules, and a culture that tolerates disruption in the name of security. That's what shadow mobilization really is: mobilization without the dramatic announcement. No parades, no ration cards on day one, just standards, drills, stockpiles, and contracts that can be activated. And once that infrastructure exists, leaders can move faster than public debate can keep up. That speed can save you. It can also drag you. If you live anywhere near these conversations, take one grounded step: follow official civil protection guidance, verify information before sharing it, and avoid DIY security fantasies. Real resilience comes from calm coordination, not vigilantism or panic. Now bring back the nuclear thread, because it's the parallel track that makes the worst case feel colder. Zaporizhzhia isn't only a symbol. It's a vulnerability with physics attached. Even without a wider war, a plant under stress, power interruptions, maintenance constraints, staffing pressure, contested control creates a category of risk that doesn't care about borders, and that's why serious planners treat it as its own worst-case line, running alongside the military. 1. If a conventional crisis is about movement, a nuclear safety crisis is about containment. One is measured in kilometers and hours, the other is measured in system stability and the absence of mistakes. So when you hear war footing, don't picture a single switch labeled war. Picture a dashboard with multiple lights blinking at once: medical throughput, transport flow, network integrity, alliance depth, nuclear safety. Margins, any one of them can trigger pressure on the others. A cyber hit slows the corridor delay increases frontline risk increases casualty load. Casualty load tests hospitals create political pressure creates rushed decisions. That loop is how a crisis feeds itself, and this is where it turns into a point of no return question, even if nobody uses that phrase. Once you've built the machine, you're tempted to use it, not because you want war, but because you've invested in speed, and speed hates hesitation. That's the knife edge. Readiness can be a cage that keeps conflict contained, or a ramp that makes escalation easier when signals are misread. In the next part, I am going to lay out 3 paths from here and the smallest detail that tells you which one we race sliding into, because the scary scenario isn't only Russia making a move, it's everyone believing they're the one who has to move first. The next question is the one nobody wants to ask out loud, because it sounds like paranoia until it suddenly sounds like policy. If Germany can flip into worst-case mode, what happens next? Does it calm the system down because Russia sees a wall of preparedness? Or does it speed the system up because everyone starts moving before anyone actually has to? I'm not asking that to be dramatic. I'm asking because readiness doesn't just change capability, it changes temptation. There are 3 paths from here, and they don't start with a tank crossing a border. They start with decisions inside meeting rooms, budget committees, and supply chains. The first path is the clean one. Europe builds the missing pieces fast, the United States stays behind the curtain as the ultimate backstop, and war footing becomes a deterrent posture that keeps things contained. In that world, the whole point is to make Moscow look at the math and decide the gamble isn't worth it. The drills are loud, the infrastructure upgrades are expensive, and the public messaging is controlled. Nobody celebrates it, but it works. The second path is messier because it's not a rupture, it's a drift. The US role shrinks in slices, not in one dramatic exit. Maybe it's slower intelligence sharing, maybe it's fewer high-end enablers, maybe it's conditional commitments wrapped in domestic politics. Europe still has NATO, still has flags and headquarters and meetings, but the capability stack becomes layered. Some countries become the new spine, others become passengers, and Germany becomes the hallway with even more pressure on it. I'll be honest, this path is the one that turns worst-case mode into a permanent lifestyle, not a temporary sprint, a long, grinding rebuild of autonomy. The third path is the low-probability, high-damage one. No one chooses it, everyone slides into it while insisting they're preventing it. Coordination breaks, trust thins, and the alliance starts reacting to shadows. A sabotage incident hits a rail node, a cyber attack scrambles emergency communications, a false rumor spreads faster than any official correction, and because both sides expect the worst, every signal gets interpreted through the most dangerous lens. That's how miscalculation happens, not because leaders are insane, but because systems under stress start treating ambiguity as a threat. If you want a simple indicator for which path we're on, watch where the investment goes. Deterrence that aims to contain builds redundancy and resilience. It strengthens civil defense, hardens networks, and drills coordination in public view. A drift toward fragmentation produces patches and improvisation, with countries duplicating efforts, arguing over procurement, and quietly lowering expectations. And the miscalculation path has its own smell, a sudden obsession with speed. Faster mobilization timelines, faster legal triggers, faster decision loops. When speed becomes the obsession, the space for diplomacy shrinks, even if nobody admits it, and that brings us back to the point that makes this feel like a point of no return. Once you normalize war footing, you normalize the trade-offs that come with it. Civilian infrastructure becomes dual use by design. Private companies become part of contingency planning. Emergency authorities expand because the crisis clock demands it. That's not automatically bad. In some countries, it's a sign of maturity. But it changes the relationship between the state and the public, because preparedness requires compliance with procedures people used to ignore. The scary part isn't the existence of the machine, it's how quietly people get used to the machine being there. The nuclear thread runs alongside all of this like a second heartbeat, and it doesn't care which path you prefer. Zaporizhzhia is the reminder that a worst case doesn't need a wider war to hurt millions. It just needs systems to fail in sequence: external power disruptions, limited redundancy, pressure on staffing, delayed repairs, and one bad decision made at the worst possible time. I keep coming back to this because it's the perfect example of modern risk. It's not cinematic, it's procedural, and procedural failures are the ones societies don't notice until they're already inside them. So what should you watch next, in real life, not in theory? First, do we see more national-level medical and logistics exercises that connect the civilian and military worlds, not just tabletop scenarios? Second, do the capability gaps get filled in concrete ways? Strategic lift, integrated air and missile defense, intelligence and surveillance, command and control, things you can't fake with slogans. Third, does the Zaporizhzhia situation generate sustained international pressure and monitoring, not just bursts of outrage after an incident? Because those three signals tell you whether Europe is building a stable deterrent posture or building speed without stability. Now, a counterpoint, because it matters: preparing for worst-case scenarios is not proof that leaders want war. In many cases, it's the opposite. The most effective peace strategy is to make yourself hard to bully, and after 2022, Europe learned the cost of assuming the future would behave. Germany's pivot can be read as late realism, not early panic. The same infrastructure that moves tanks can move humanitarian aid. The same cyber defenses that protect military logistics can protect hospitals. The same shelter planning that sounds dystopian can save lives in floods, blackouts, or accidents. That doesn't erase the risk of miscalculation, but it does explain why governments do this even when it's unpopular. If you're a viewer trying to stay grounded, do one boring thing that actually helps: rely on official emergency guidance in your country, keep a modest 72-hour supply plan, and don't amplify unverified claims during crises. Calm information is infrastructure, so where does that leave us? Not with a prophecy, but with a reality. Europe is building the ability to function under pressure. Germany is the hinge because geography makes it unavoidable. And once worst-case mode becomes operational, readiness stops being a talking point and becomes a capacity that shapes everyone's choices. The uncomfortable truth is that deterrence and escalation can look identical in their early stages. The difference is intention, communication, and the ability to absorb shocks without overreacting. And that's why I want your take, because it tells me how you're reading the same signals. Do you think this push is designed to contain a larger war, or does it create momentum that could escalate one through misread moves? Comment one word, contain or escalate, if you want more breakdowns like this, less noise, more mechanism. Subscribe, because the next time a hypothesis starts turning into procedures, you'll want to recognize it before the headlines catch up.